Widespread media reports, bolstered by government sources, called 2020 the most active Atlantic hurricane season on record, and they blamed it on global warming. It included a record breaking 30 named storms. But when we compare 2020 with previous years, are we really comparing apples and oranges, or are we comparing apples and onions? Legendary hurricane scientist Dr. Neil Frank, longest serving director of the National Hurricane Center, joins us tonight to discuss how and why the official reports are misleading. Thanks for joining us tonight. Megan Kennard, our Director of Communications with Cornwall Alliance, who's often with me on the program, wasn't able to be with me tonight, but I'm glad you are, and I'm glad that our guest Neil Frank will be as well. Before we get into that, just let me mention to you that as our way of saying thanks for a donation of any size, when you donate any amount to the Cornwall Alliance, we would love to send you a copy of the new monograph, The Red and the Green, China's Useful Idiots. This is an amazing report on how the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese national government, use green groups, environmental groups in the West, as well as in China and other parts of the world, to promote China's own ambitious agenda toward world domination. This is a booklet that I think many of you will want to read. It's clear, it's consistent, it's powerful. And to request this, all you need to do is to go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, fill out the donation form, and in the comments field, ask for the red and the green, or mention promo code 2101, 21-01. I'd also encourage you to invite your friends to join you in watching on Facebook this evening, and to post comments, ask questions in the comments field. We will be trying to do our best to follow those as they come in and hope to address those for you. Again, our topic tonight is, was the 2020 Atlantic hurricane season really the busiest on record? As I mentioned, widespread media reports and government sources called 2020 the most active Atlantic hurricane season on record. They blamed it on global warming, and it included a record-breaking 30 named storms. But I'm convinced, and I think you will be too after you hear Dr. Neil Frank talk about this, that in fact we're not comparing apples and apples when we compare 2020 with earlier years. We're comparing apples and onions. Dr. Neil Frank joins us now. And Neil, thank you so much for coming on with us tonight. Before we jump into the topic, well, let's just find out who you are and what is your background as a hurricane scientist? What qualifies you to speak on climate change's impact on hurricanes?
Cal, what a privilege it is to be with you tonight, and I'm very intrigued by this little pamphlet that you're advertising there. What an interesting concept. It's interesting that I backdoored into meteorology. I started out in life to become a basketball coach. I played basketball at a small college in Kansas for 4 years and had every intention of becoming a basketball coach. And the second year on the campus, I ran into the chemistry professor, and he said, you need to come on over and major in science. Then when you graduate, you can become a science teacher, basketball coach, and that'll give you a competitive edge over all of your friends that are phys ed majors, because they're always looking for science teachers, and so you would qualify for that. So that's the way that I majored in science. And then when I was in a junior in college, I got my draft notes, and I knew that I was headed for the Army. Okay. But the Air Force said, if you go into the meteorology program, we'll let you finish your college, and then we'll send you to St. Louis University for a year where you can get your education in meteorology. Now, I didn't work that hard at the science, and I wasn't really sure what meteorology was all about, but it sounded better than 2 years in the Army, so I signed up real fast and found out that meteorology was forecasting the weather. And I said a number of times in my life, if I had known that eventually I was going to try to forecast the weather, or I would be required to forecast the weather, I think maybe I would have taken my 2 years in the Army, because some of the forecasts that we've had to make have been very difficult. But the Air Force sent me to Okinawa, and that's where I was introduced into the tropics. And I spent two summers on Okinawa. The first summer I was there, I was in 3 typhoons. I mean, if you're in the Western Pacific, you're going to see a lot of typhoons. Same thing that we call hurricanes in the Atlantic. They have about 25 typhoons a year in the Western Pacific. And so it's a very active place. Well, I got out of the Air Force and decided maybe I had more experience in forecasting weather than I did in basketball coaching. So I entered the graduate school at Florida State University and eventually received a master's degree and then the PhD. And then the Weather Service encouraged me to come down to the Hurricane Center permanently in 1960 or 61, and I served there for 25 years. Had the privilege of being the director from 1974 to 1987. So I had 14 years as the director of the Hurricane Center. And if you take the, well, then I left there, retired, and came to Houston and decided that I would be on an air, I would provide on-air meteorology at a CBS station here. Maybe work 3 years. Well, I ended up working 21 years. So I have tracked hurricanes for about 50 years of my life. And if I added up all the hurricanes that I've tracked, I've probably tracked somewhere in the vicinity of 400 to 500, including those in the Pacific as well as those in the Atlantic. And so I have a lot of experience. I have a lot of misses, and I have some hits.
Yeah. Well, when I lived in South Florida, I tracked hurricanes too, but I don't think I came anywhere near 500 or so.
Yeah.
Well, back last month in the website whatsupwiththat.com, you published an article that you wrote at my request called "How Busy Was the 2020 Hurricane Season?" And we just republished that on Cornwall Alliance's blog. I was I was surprised to find that we had not done it before just now. Last Friday we did it. I think it was Friday. But at any rate, we've just republished that. And in that article, you spend considerable time explaining how different kinds of Atlantic storms form. Uh, why is that important to this question of
Yeah.
how busy was the 2020 Atlantic hurricane season? And then, in addition to answering that, can you review the different ways that the different kinds of storms form?
Yeah, there's no question about that. It's very important to look at the 2020 hurricane season. 30 hurricanes, unbelievable. And as Cal, as you've already indicated, there are numerous people coming out and said, "Oh, it's global warming, and the global warming is caused by carbon dioxide. Therefore, we must stop burning fossil fuels." And let me start at the outset of this to make sure there's no misunderstanding. The Earth has been warming for the last 150 years. That's not debatable. What is arguable is whether carbon dioxide is causing that. Regardless of whatever is causing it, I would tell you that there are three reasons why we had an active hurricane season in 2020. One of those is associated with a meteorological event, but then there are two non-meteorological events that have increased the number of storms that we have in our official record. So let's start with the meteorological event. Hurricanes love warm water. And anytime the water in the Atlantic is warm, you're going to see more hurricanes. If the waters cool off, you see less hurricanes. And it's interesting to note that there is a 60-year cycle in the water temperatures in the Atlantic. And this 60-year cycle phases very well with the 60-year cycle in the Earth's temperature. In other words, there is 30 years of warming, and then there is 30 years of cooling, and 30 years of warming, and 30 years of cooling. So if we go back over the last 150 years, there's been 3 periods when we've had warming. Coming out of the Little Ice Age in the mid 1800s, we had warming up until the end of the 1800s, 1880, 1890. And there was a whole flurry of hurricanes at that particular time. Then the Earth cooled from the 1880 to 1910, and there was a reduction in the number of hurricanes. Another
Okay.
significant warming occurred from 1910 until 1940, and there was a whole flurry of hurricane activity in the 40s and the 50s. Then we went into a very cold period from 1940 to 1975. As a matter of fact, there were experts that watched that trend at that time and felt like that we were headed towards an ice age. Well, the Earth turned around on that 60-year cycle, and it warmed then from 1975 to 1998, and we saw an increase in the hurricane activity. So one of the reasons we've seen more storms in the last 2 decades is because we are in a warm cycle. Now, the number of hurricanes we're seeing in this warm cycle exceeds the number of hurricanes that we had in the next warm cycle and the one in the 1800s. But there was a whole flurry of hurricane activities in the 40s and the 50s. As a matter of fact, hurricane in Florida alone, they had 7 hurricanes during a 10-year period in the 40s. Then we had 6 or 7 hurricanes in the Carolinas during the 50s. So what we're experiencing now is we're back in a warm cycle starting in 1995 with 19 named storms. And so we're seeing an increase in number because we are in a warm cycle. 2005,
So,
we had 29 named storms. And again, in 2020, we now have 30 named storms.
so
So
there,
part of the reason,
that's the real
yeah,
meteorological reason behind this.
right.
But you mentioned that there are a couple of other reasons that are not
That's right.
meteorological, right? Get
That's
into
right.
those for us.
And that's what I want to really stress on. Although, let me emphasize that this warm cycle that we're experiencing now has nothing to do with carbon dioxide and global warming. We are in a
Yeah.
natural warm cycle. And in natural
Yeah.
warm cycles, you see more hurricanes. Now, let's take a look at a couple of non meteorological reasons why we're seeing more hurricanes. How about satellites? We started seeing satellites in the operational center in the late 1960s. So let's go from 1970. And as we take a look at the entire Atlantic, the reconnaissance airplane that we were using before satellites to go out and investigate hurricanes, those reconnaissance planes cannot reach into the eastern Atlantic. About 2/3 of the Atlantic Ocean is not accessible with reconnaissance airplanes. So if you draw a vertical line down through the Atlantic in the western half of it, so of it, that's as far as the aircraft can go. So what's happening in the eastern Atlantic? Well, satellites have indicated there's a lot of hurricanes and tropical storms that form out there that we didn't know were there prior to the satellite. A good illustration of that.
Okay.
In 2005, there was 29 named storms. Do you know how many formed in the eastern Atlantic? 7 that never crossed over a line to where we could investigate them by a reconnaissance airplane. So the only
So in the
reason that
past,
we
we would
knew that,
never have even counted
yeah,
those 7? Okay. Yeah.
absolutely. If we hadn't had
They could have been there, but we wouldn't have seen
satellites,
them.
That's right. We wouldn't have known that we're there. Now,
Ah,
the way that we knew that hurricanes were in that part of the ocean before satellites was an occasional ship would pass through one. But the shipping routes in the eastern two-thirds of the Atlantic are not very abundant. A lot of ships go across the North Atlantic and down the European coast, but you have this vast region out there where there's not a lot of ships. Now,
okay.
I can show you exactly the impact of hurricanes that have on the number of storms in the Atlantic. I went back and took a look at the number of hurricanes that we recorded in the Eastern Atlantic for a 25-year period prior to satellites. And if you look at the records, about once every 2 years did we record a hurricane or a tropical storm in the Eastern Atlantic. Now, with satellites, we're averaging 2 to 3 storms per year in the Eastern Atlantic. We would not have known that was there if it hadn't been for the satellite. So I estimate that somewhere between 2 and 3 additional storms are being added to the records that has nothing to do with global warming. It has a whole lot to do with we have better observing tools. So one
I
of the
see.
reasons that we're seeing more storms today is because we now have satellites.
Okay.
The
And
second
I,
reason, yeah, go
yeah,
ahead.
I was going to ask you. You mentioned there are two other factors,
Right,
and that's the one: our better observing
right,
facilities. But
right,
there is another one as well. According to your article, criteria
right,
by which hurricane
right,
specialists at the National Hurricane Center
right.
decide whether to name a storm have changed over the years. So, what are the changes, and
Yeah.
what difference do they make?
Oh, it makes a big difference in the number of storms that we record in the official records. And in order to explain that, I've got to go back and explain to you how hurricanes form. Okay.
Okay,
One of the
yeah, to where we
requirements for
started,
a
right?
hurricane, yeah, is to have a pre existing weather disturbance that is causing thunderstorms. Now, in the Atlantic, we have four pre existing weather disturbances. And I'm going to divide the Atlantic into a North Atlantic that I'm going to call the Subtropical Atlantic. And then the deep Atlantic, the deep tropics, would be in the southern part of the Atlantic. And I'm going to use the latitude 25 degrees north as the boundary for this separation. And the
Okay,
25 degrees is about where Miami is located. So all the islands, and most of them in the Bahamas and all the islands in the Caribbean, are in what I would call the deep tropics. Now, there are two pre-existing kind of disturbance that form in the deep tropics that are very important as far as hurricane activity is concerned. Without question, African disturbances are the are the most critical factor. We follow about 50 African disturbances every year. Every 3 to 5 days, a disturbance moves off the coast of Africa, and underneath the influence of the trade wind, they move westward all the way across the Atlantic, even the Caribbean, and sometimes some of those disturbances make it all the way into the Pacific. And you see some of the storms that form in the Eastern Pacific actually have their origin all the way back into Africa. And out of the 50 disturbances that we follow, something in the order of 10 to 15% of that 50 become the named storms in the Atlantic. Now, in
okay,
addition, in the Atlantic and the deep tropics, we have what is called the intertropical convergence zone. That's where the air from the northern hemisphere clashes with air from the southern hemisphere, and we see thunderstorms that form along this boundary. And every once in a while, one of those little disturbances will form into one of our named storms. Now, the energy process that causes the hurricane to form in the deep tropics with the African disturbance or the ICT disturbances is very simple. These disturbances cause thunderstorms. Thunderstorms heat the atmosphere. Hot air rises and it's replaced at the surface by air spiraling in. If the heat of the thunderstorm is sufficient and the air rises fast enough, then the winds at the surface can exceed tropical storm force and maybe even hurricane force. So it's thunderstorms caused by these disturbances in the deep tropics that are so important for the hurricane activity in the Atlantic. Now let's shift gears and go into the subtropical Atlantic. Remember now, north of 25 degrees north. The process by which hurricanes form in the subtropics is a lot more complex. It's associated with what I call baroclinic energy. What do I mean by baroclinic energy? Anytime you have cold air side by side warm air, the cold air tries to ride under the warm air, and this causes wind.
Okay.
The baroclinic, or this type of energy, is the driving force for all winter storms. And sometimes we have winter storms that form in the summertime. So I call these winter type storms in the summertime. Okay. So let me paint a little. Well, first of all, there are two types of these storms. One of them is in the upper part of the atmosphere, up where jet airplanes fly 25, 30, 35,000 feet. And we have these little low pressure areas that form there every summer. And they go migrating towards the west. And normally they don't cause any problem. But every once in a while, one of those will spin down to the surface and cause thunderstorms. And the thunderstorm heat the whole system up, and it gradually morphs in to a tropical cyclone or to a named storm. But by far more common is the development that takes place when a cold front moves off of the coast of the United States and even down into the Gulf of Mexico, and sometime in the late fall all the way into the Western Caribbean Sea. And it stalls. And then a weather disturbance will form along that front. Now, the energy process associated with this little weather disturbance that forms is cold and warm air, or baroclinic kind of energy. Now, as this system forms and begins to strengthen, it causes thunderstorms. If the thunderstorms become numerous and start heating the atmosphere, then it can gradually morph into a true tropical system. So should you name those kind of storms? Not unless the tropical energy becomes sufficient that it dominates the baroclinic energy. And so if we go back into time, way back into time, we didn't name those kind of storms. It wasn't our goal at the Hurricane Center to name winter type storms, even though they are forming in the summertime. But over the last few years, there's been a change in the philosophy. And the only thing that I can use to explain that is the people at the Hurricane Center now are a lot more conscientious about wind. And so when an airplane goes out and finds winds that exceed the threshold for a tropical storm, immediately they put a name on it, regardless of whether it has tropical energy or it has baroclinic energy. Now, last year, we named 10 of those storms. 10. Unreal. Okay. Let's go back in time. Did we used to name those kind of storms? Let me go back into the records and go 25 years before we had satellites. And in that 25-year period, on the average, we named one of these baroclinic type of storms every 2 years. Last year, we named 10. Over the last 25 years, we're averaging 5 storms a year that develop under this process. And over the last 10 years, if you break that down into 10 years, we've averaged 5 storms a year. So we were naming a lot more of these storms in the subtropics that would not have been named a number of years ago. As a matter of fact, if you go back to that period of 25 years before satellites, on the average, African disturbances and the IT disturbances formed 70% or more of the named storms. And the baroclinic kind of storms only accounted for less than 30%. But that whole thing has changed now. And over the last 25 years, we still have the African disturbances, but now they only amount to 55% of the named storms, while the baroclinic type storms are now amounting to 45%. Has there been a decrease in the number of African disturbances? Absolutely not. We still are seeing the same number of African disturbances. What has happened over the last few years is we're naming those baroclinic type storms. Now, this creates quite a problem because once that storm forms, it's formed because of thunderstorms, right? And now the disturbance or the named storm moves into colder water. You know what happens? The thunderstorms stop forming. And a new burst of cold energy, cold air, moves into the system. And so the baroclinic energy now becomes the dominant energy with this type of storm. Did the storm decrease in intensity? No, the winds are still 45 miles an hour. It's just blowing around a cold core rather than a warm core. And so the Hurricane Center now has got a problem. They denamed those kind of storms. And last year, we denamed 5 or 6 of those kind of storms, had a
But
lifetime of only 24 or maybe in one case 36 hours. We named one storm within 6 hours of crossing the Portugal coast. And the B storm last year, we named at 8 o'clock in the morning, and by 1 o'clock in the afternoon, it was inland. So
now,
we're naming a
Neil,
whole lot of, yeah,
hold on just a second though. I got to ask
yeah.
you this. You say we dename some of these storms. Does that mean that we can now, take that name that was given to this storm and give it to a
Yeah.
different storm instead? Or
No, no,
or
no, no, I
that
don't
name
mean
just
mean.
goes into the books and we add
Yeah,
on another name next time.
yeah. No, we don't know. We don't dename this storm. We just say that it has lost its tropical characteristic, and now it's a winter type storm. It
So
still goes in the book. Yeah,
If you've named
absolutely.
Betsy and
That's right.
then you decide, we're going to dename her, that doesn't mean
Yeah.
that the next storm comes along, you can name Betsy too. It's Betsy's
No, no.
done. Betsy, you're out of that name. Now you
That's
have to
right.
use another name, even though, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, you wouldn't have
Yeah,
named Betsy in the first place. So the next storm
that's
could have been
right.
named Betsy. Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah, and all that does is add numbers to our storm total. So let's take a look at the 2020 hurricane season. I told you that we named 10 of these baroclinic kind of storms. And then in the eastern Atlantic, we had 3 of the African systems that weakened before they got into the western Atlantic. And we had the one storm. It was the alpha storm. We went through the alphabet. We went through all of
Yeah.
our named storms. So we started using the Greek alphabet. And I think the alpha storm was the one we named just before it made landfall in Portugal. So if you take a look at the number of storms that we had in the subtropics and in the Eastern Atlantic, it totals about 13.
Yeah.
So if
Now,
we compare now, yeah, go ahead.
yeah. There does seem to have been a general upward trend in the number of tropical storms detected over the last 80 years or so. Is that right, Neil? I
That's
mean, you're
right.
not completely discounting that, right?
No.
I think, don't we have yeah, there we go. We've got this graph that
Right.
shows the number of major Atlantic hurricanes,
Right.
1851 to 2020. Kind of comment on that for us a little bit, will you?
Yeah, leave that chart up because this points out the point that I was trying to make you that hurricanes are more active when there's a warm period. Let's go over on the left-hand side of your graph there. As we came out of the little ice age, we warmed up till 1880. Look at the increase in hurricanes that formed there at that time. Then we went into a cool period up until 1910, and there was a decrease in the number of hurricanes. And then from 1910 up to 1940, there was a major warming. The warming was about the same intensity as we see today. And look at that period of the 40s and the 50s. In the 40s,
Uh-huh.
I told you that Florida had 7 hurricanes in a 10-year period. Then the earth cooled from 1940 till 1975. And look at the drop off in the number of storms during that period up until 1990.
Now,
Then
as I'm looking at this,
the
though, Neil,
yeah,
as I'm looking at this, the drop off in the number of storms really looks like it starts in perhaps the early 50s rather than around
well, yeah, a
1940.
little bit, right,
So do you
right.
have a kind of a delay there as well?
Yeah.
What?
Well, it is, Cal, keep in mind that the water temperatures in both the Atlantic and the Pacific lag a little behind the temperature of the Earth.
Ah, that's right. Because
So you're seeing
ocean
a little
water
bit of a
has
lag there.
about
Yeah,
ocean water has what, about 1,000 times as much energy as the
absolutely,
atmosphere. So the atmosphere
absolutely.
cools a whole lot faster or warms a whole lot
Yeah,
faster than the
that's right.
ocean does. Okay. All right.
That's
Now
right.
set me right on that.
So the
Thanks.
curve will lag a little bit behind the actual peak temperatures that I showed you. But see, in
Okay.
1995, we had 19 named storms. Look what happened as we start seeing the cycle up. And this graph doesn't go over to 2020, but if it did, you'd see 2020 and a big number of storms there. Okay. And this is
Yeah.
just major hurricane. This isn't the total number of hurricanes. This is the name are the major hurricanes, ones of
Which
three,
is
fours, and
category
five.
3 and up, right? Is that
Three, four,
category
and
3
five.
and up? Yeah. Okay.
Yep, exactly. So
Okay.
if we had a chart that shows all the storms, you can see that the trend upward is even more dramatic than it is here. But
Huh.
the point that we try to make is yes, we are seeing more hurricanes because we're in a warm cycle. But there's a couple of other reasons why we're seeing more storms, and it has nothing to do with the warm cycle. It has to do with the fact that we have satellites, and there's been a change in the philosophy of the way that we name some of those storms. And I'm
Okay.
not criticizing the Hurricane Center for necessarily for naming those storms. That's not the purpose of the comments that I'm making. The purpose of the comments is that I'm telling you is the hurricane records have been contaminated by some non-meteorological influences.
And it would be helpful if the NHC folks would make that clear to the media so that when the media report
Yeah,
these things, they would say, now, some of this may be attributable to actually more storms, but some of it is also attributable to a change in how we go about deciding whether to name
exactly.
storms. We're going to get back to this in just
Exactly.
a minute. I just want to remind our audience that for the month of January, as our thanks when you make a donation of literally any size to the Cornwall Alliance. We would love to send you this monograph called The Red and the Green, China's Useful Idiots, about how the Chinese Communist Party uses environmental organizations in the West as well as in China itself to promote its agenda of world domination. To request your copy, just go to cornwallalliance.org. Click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donate form, when you come to the comments field, simply put in the red and the green or refer to promo code 21 01. We would love to send this to you. We think that you'll find it interesting. We think that you'll find it something that you want to share with your friends and neighbors. One of the most important things that we need to understand is what our potential enemies are doing and how they use the weaknesses that we have in the West against us. Okay, back to Neil Frank. Neil, lots of media made much of the fact that in 2020, three hurricanes hit Louisiana, as if that were unprecedented. Now, you challenge that, don't you?
Well,
And why?
yes, because it has happened before. Okay. As a matter of fact, there were three hurricanes that made landfall in Louisiana. Now, Louisiana also was threatened by a couple of other tropical storms that passed a little bit to the right and a little bit to the left. But it's interesting to have three hurricanes in the same year hit a state. Well, it has happened before in the past. We can go back to 1886. Now, that's long before we had SUVs and long before we were burning a lot of fossil fuel. But if we can pull up that graph that shows
Here we go.
1886, we have as a matter of fact, if you go back into the records, more hurricanes made landfall in 1886 than any other year. And landfall, I'm talking about the lower 48. Three hurricanes moved into the panhandle of Florida the same year. And even more important, four hurricanes made landfall in Texas, and two of those were major. And the last major hurricane in October destroyed what was at that time a thriving coastal community called Indianola. Now, Indianola was a community located on the south shore of Matagorda Bay. And it's my understanding that somewhere in the neighborhood of 20,000 people lived there. And what they were doing is they were bringing the ships were coming in to Matagorda Bay and unloading there in Indianola. Then the material would move on westward on the railroad. Well, in 1875, a Category 4 hurricane did a lot of destruction in Indianola. They rebuilt the city, and it was thriving when 1886 came along and destroyed what was there. And so
Hmm.
Indianola, Texas, a thriving coastal. As a matter of fact, I would tell you this, Cal, if it hadn't been for those two hurricanes, Indianola would probably be the Galveston of today.
Huh. Huh. Okay. You've also written in your article
Yeah,
that's on our
Cal,
website.
before we get off the hurricane
No,
here,
go
let
ahead.
me ask you one. Yeah, um, one of the things that can be asked is there any indication of an increase in hurricane activity in the Atlantic because of global warming? Well, I've come to the conclusion the only valid way that you can determine whether there has been an increase in activity in the Atlantic is take the landfall of the major hurricanes. Now, I'm talking about three, fours, and fives. Landfall in the lower 48 of the major hurricanes. Now, I think that
Why
all
is
of us
that?
would agree. Well, I think that all of us would agree back in the 1800s or maybe early 1900s, if you had a coastal community that was very sparsely populated, that you might have had a tropical storm make landfall and it never be recorded. But I'm
Okay.
convinced that when you have a major hurricane of 110-mile-an-hour winds or more, I'll bet you that every one of those has been in the record since 1885. So,
Yeah,
in
you
other
know,
words, if you,
I if I can throw this in just as a
yeah,
layman, when I
yeah,
moved to South Florida, I had never really thought much about hurricanes before, but shortly after we moved there, I think when we arrived, hurricane or tropical storm Ernesto was on its way.
yeah,
My first name happens to be Ernest, so we figured I was being welcomed. Actually, my memory was wrong here. Ernesto was the second one to come after we arrived. The first one to come after we arrived was Hurricane Deborah, and that's my wife's name.
oh,
So we felt very much welcomed to South Florida. But what I had never really been conscious of before was just how huge hurricanes can be. Now, tropical storms can have a diameter of, maybe 40, 50, 60, 80 miles, something like
yeah,
that. But a major hurricane, an actual hurricane itself, even a Cat 1, can be several hundred miles in diameter. A 3, 4, 5 can have a diameter reaching to 700 or 800 miles. And, so when you mentioned that, okay, a small tropical storm or something could come over a sparsely populated area and never really be noticed or reported, but a major hurricane, a Cat 3, Cat 4, Cat 5, boy, that would not go unreported, even at times when the population densities of the Florida and Georgia and South and North Carolina coasts were pretty slim. So I understand why you would put it that way.
yeah. Yeah, major hurricanes have been recorded since 1850. A tropical storm, a weak hurricane in the 1800s or the early 1900s, yeah, might have gone by. So let's take a look at just the major hurricanes that have made landfall. Now, on the average, we see one major hurricane make landfall every 2 years. Do
Hmm.
you know that from 2005 to 2017, there were no major hurricanes hit the lower 48? So if you take
Yeah.
a look at the major hurricanes that have made landfall, there has been a decrease over the last 150 years, and there has been a significant decrease since the 40s and the 50s, and that's when we had all those hurricanes hit Florida and the Carolinas. So the
Okay.
major hurricane landfall would suggest there has been no increase in hurricane activity in the Atlantic.
Okay. All right. So now back to your article. You wrote there that a fair comparison of the 1933 hurricane season with 2020 would be to reduce the number of storms in 2020 by around 10. If we do that, 1933 is still one of the most active hurricane summers in modern times. So, what you've been describing to us is basically why we should take around 10 storms out of the count for 2020 or something like that, something in that neighborhood.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, if we apply the same rules that we had, observing rules that we had in 1933 to the 2020 hurricane season, we had 10 hurricanes form in the subtropical Atlantic. That's where I get the number 10. Then we had 3 hurricanes that didn't, they formed from African disturbance, but didn't move into the Western Atlantic. So I might even add up to 10 to 13. So if you take 13 storms away from the 2020 total, then you come down to 17. Well, in 1933, they had 21 storms. Not one storm was recorded in the subtropical Atlantic. Not one storm was recorded in the eastern Atlantic. 17 storms all formed from African disturbances. There was 4 baroclinic storms that formed in the Gulf of Mexico in the Western Caribbean Sea. And it's interesting, in 2020, 17 storms again formed from African disturbances, but 13 storms formed from the baroclinic type storm. So I'm suggesting that the activity in 1933 was about comparable to what it was today. And this dispels this whole concept that, it's global warming that is increasing the number of storms.
Yeah. I remember clear back in 2006, Neil, you and I had a conversation by phone. It was the first time I ever got to know you. I had heard of you as the director of the NHC, but past director at that point. But you had phoned me at my office after you had seen something that I had said that got quoted in the news about the idea that actually global warming, while it might result in slightly stronger storms because the ocean water might be a bit warmer, it might actually result in fewer storms. And I had been pretty thoroughly attacked for that and ridiculed because, after all, I'm not a meteorologist, I'm not a climatologist. And you phoned me up in my office, and what did you say to me then?
Well, it's interesting if we go back to the energy concept that operates within the atmosphere itself. The primary energy process is this baroclinic energy. In other words, you have the cold air in the polar regions clashing with the warm air in the tropical regions. Now, if and global warming, and I think this is verified by all the studies that I've seen, that the main warming that is taking place in the warmer or in the polar regions. So what you're seeing is a decrease in the temperature difference between the poles and the tropics, and this would suggest that maybe we'll see less energy and some of the storms will be less intense. Uh, the primary purpose of hurricanes is to remove heat out of the tropics and move it into the polar latitudes where it can warm up the polar latitudes. Well, if the global warming is warming that up, then we wouldn't see a need for the major hurricanes. So
Okay.
philosophically, you can argue a point like this.
Yeah. Our producer, Jim Moline, has just mentioned to me, notified me that he has a chart for 1933. So it might be helpful to take a look at that. That is a true spaghetti chart, isn't it? that's
Absolutely.
that's the storms for
See,
1933.
all those
Pretty
storms
busy.
came out of the tropics. All
Yeah.
those storms that came basically out of the tropics.
Huh.
And up there in
Okay.
the corner, that is tropical storm activity in the Gulf. Okay.
All right. All
So
right.
there was no storms registered in the Eastern Atlantic and that formed there and stayed there. Is what I'm telling you. and there
Uh-huh.
was no storms formed in the subtropical.
Okay. Um, so now, tomorrow, uh, Joe Biden is set
Yes.
to be inaugurated as our next president, and he has promised to put the United States back into the Paris Climate Agreement. You have some thoughts about that, Neil. What do you think is going to be the effect of our rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement? Is the Paris Climate Agreement going to be successful in trying to curtail global warming, and what will be its impact on the global economy, particularly on the poor around the world?
Yeah, let's describe what this Paris Agreement is all about. This agreement was made in December of 2015 in Paris when 194 countries around the globe got together. And they all agreed to three things. Number one, they would reduce the amount of carbon dioxide. Number two, they would develop green energy. In other words, convert from fossil energy to green energy. And number three, they realized the developing nations would not have the resources to do this conversion. So they agreed that they would set up a fund that would be disseminated to these developing countries to develop green energy. And the goal at that time in 2015 was by 2020, that's where we are today, that fund would be $100 billion. Now it's
Per
interesting.
year.
Who are the developing nations? Right. The developing nations, I wasn't there at the conference, but I thought it was very interesting that out of 194, 150 were designated as developing nations, including China and India. There were 44 donor nations. And then the UN decided to get this whole thing started, we need $10 billion. And so 90% of the $10 billion was pledged by six countries. The United States pledged $3 billion, and our previous president sent $1 billion over the week that he left office. And then you had Sweden, Japan, Germany, France, and England all all pledged about $1 billion. Well, I took a look at the numbers and how are we doing on the pledges in 2018, and not too good. As a matter of fact, Trump took us out of the Paris Agreement. So we have $2 billion that we never put in there that we originally pledged. Well, I saw an interesting article recently that said finally, with $100 million from Australia, they have reached the $10 billion goal.
But they're supposed to
Well,
be
wait
doing
a minute.
100 billion a year, right?
That's right, each year, and starting in 2020. Now, we pledged one third of the original amount. To go back into the Paris Agreement, we would have to have immediately $2 billion sent over to the United Nations to satisfy our initial pledge. Are we going to be asked to do a third of the $100 billion every year? Who knows? But I can assure you that it'll be a very expensive process. And in the meantime, we're going to destroy our fossil fuels. 80-90% of the world operates on fossil fuels because of the release of the drilling that President Trump was able to bring about. We are now energy independent. Well, we would lose that, and the cost of the Paris Agreement is into the trillions of dollars. For what?
Yeah.
Well, all of the experts that I've seen would suggest that it wouldn't save the temperature even 1 degree centigrade.
Yeah, I think probably the most widely cited studies on that were by Bjorn Lomborg, the Danish
Yeah,
economist, who actually assumed that all the things that the supporters of the Paris Agreement were saying
right,
about global warming were true, and
right.
he assumed that what they themselves estimated as to the cost of implementing the Paris Agreement was true. And he assumed that what they were claiming would be the resulting cooling from the Paris Agreement implementation was true. All right. So he's giving them the store. And when he did that, he ran the numbers, and what he showed was that full implementation of the Paris Agreement by all of the countries that had signed on all the way to the end of this century would cost an average of about $1 to $2 trillion per year. And
Yep.
that comes to roughly 70 to 140 trillion dollars, and that's actually just going from 2030 onward to the end of the century. That's when the costs really start to pile up. But 70 to 140 trillion dollars, and even taking their own word for it, the reduction in global temperature by that time would be about 0.3 Fahrenheit.
There you go.
So my thinking, and I'm quite confident that you are with me on this, Neil, is
Right.
that getting us back into the Paris Agreement is all pain for no gain. There is no
That's right.
significant cooling of the Earth that comes from it, as if that cooling would be good, even if we could achieve it, and I don't think that it would be. But besides that, the cost of it is just outrageously high.
Right.
So I would hope that that at least some people in the United States Senate would be getting the courage, the conviction, the spine, the backbone to stand up and say, "Hey, this is not just an executive agreement. The vast majority of countries around the world have treated it as a treaty, and you need to send this over here to the Senate for us to debate and decide whether we are going to approve our getting back into this." Unfortunately, I don't think that's likely to happen, but
Yeah.
we'll see. Okay, well,
Cal,
Neil,
Cal,
thank you very much
can I add a
again for
couple more?
joining us. And
Yeah.
got one more comment,
Uh,
closing words for
yeah, I
us?
was going to make another quick comment. What is the purpose? What is the driving force behind the Paris Agreement? I'm convinced that it's international distribution of wealth. Whose wealth?
Yep.
Our wealth. All right. It's to establish a one world government. And we will pay the price for that move.
And that's not just your opinion, by the way. The German economist Ottmar Edenhofer, who was one of the
Yeah.
co-chairs of the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, very explicitly said that we should get rid of the idea that the Paris Agreement or that anything related to the Framework Convention on Climate Change was about climate. It was instead about
Right.
redistributing the world's wealth, de facto
That's right.
redistributing the world's wealth. The former chairwoman of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, I've forgotten her name. She's from Costa Rica. She said that this whole negotiation process was our best chance for the first time ever to completely reform the world's economy, to get us away from capitalism and into socialism. And the French prime minister, back in 1999, said that the Kyoto Agreement, which was a lighter version of what has since then become the
Yeah.
Paris Agreement, was a first step toward global governance. So even the friends of this thing see this as you have just stated, Neil. Well, again, Neil, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it. Appreciate all of the advice that you give me, all of the help you give me in understanding these things, and we try to pass that on to Cornwall Alliance's audience through our website, cornwallalliance.org, through our YouTube channel, our Facebook page, and various other ways. Thanks so much for that. I would remind our audience that through the end of January, when you make a gift of any size, if you request it, we will be glad to send you, as our way of saying thanks, a copy of The Red and the Green, China's Useful Idiots. Just go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and when you reach the comments field, mention The Red and the Green or promo code 21-01, and we will be glad to send that to you. Now, next week, our guest will be Mallory Quigley, who is the Vice President of Communications for the Susan B. Anthony List, a major pro-life organization here in the United States. Our topic will be the March for Life, which is annually among the largest demonstrations in Washington, D.C., which goes virtual this year in the time of COVID-19. And we'll be talking about the March for Life, about Roe v. Wade, about the state of the pro-life movement, and the challenges and opportunities arising from the inauguration of President Joe Biden, who has been a firm supporter of abortion throughout his political career. So please plan on joining us next Tuesday evening. And meanwhile, may the Lord be with you all, and may you be a mirror of the love and the grace of Jesus Christ.